Principal at Apti Institute. Further to my left, Dr. Mehdi Snen, Senior Advisor to the UN Security General's Special Envoy for Digital and Emerging Technologies and member of the UN Office for Digital and Emerging Technologies. And then, last but not least, on the end, Sourav Daz, who's Chief of Staff of Investments at Co-Develop. But before we hear from these excellent speakers, I'm going to briefly sketch out the landscape as I see it, which for the most part is two quite distinct technology communities that are colliding and scaling together. So the first is DPI, Digital Public Infrastructure, and you know, for decades now, countries across the global majority, led actually initially by our host country, India, have built open interoperable systems like your digital IDs, digital payment systems, and data exchange, with the guiding principles of transparency, public ownership, openness, and ultimately citizen benefit, right? It was designed to improve education, healthcare, and so on, while reducing costs and improving access and inclusion for citizens. And then, on the other hand, I see AI innovation, the reason we're all here today, which in many ways operates very differently, right? It's largely proprietary, it has huge levels of investments. It's often foreign-owned, dominated by the two sort of superpowers, the US and Chinese tech giants, who are ultimately racing to export these systems globally to the global south as well. And the features here are very different. Competitive advantage, often closed architectures, and commercial return. So from hardware to compute, cloud, the whole AI stack is to some extent locked down, and as I see it, very different to the principles of DPI, which has pushed for greater openness. But these two efforts now we're seeing colliding in government services, in chatbots fielding new citizen queries, in every algorithm now detecting fraud, and translation services, something that the Indian government is rolling out successfully now. So AI is seeking integration into society, but DPI is seeking greater efficiencies. So in many ways, they should be sort of the perfect partners in crime, right? But they do operate very differently, right? With very different rules and principles. So for me, the question isn't whether we integrate AI and DPI. I think it's very clear that's already happening. The question is on whose terms, with what governance mechanisms, what safeguards, and what costs could this have to sovereignty, new dependencies, autonomy, and I suppose ultimately what cost could this have to the public interest principles that DPI was initially founded upon. So over the next, I think we've got around 50 minutes or so. Yeah, we're going to be exploring these questions and ultimately trying to seek to understand if these two worlds can be reconciled in some way, and actually if they can ultimately be used to enhance one another, right? That's the world that I personally would like to see. And yes, towards the end, we'll try and open the floor for 10 minutes or so of Q&A, so please start thinking of potential questions. So yeah, without further ado, if I could start with you, Dr. Mehdi. What would a successful vision of AI-DPI integration in the Global South look like to you?
Thanks so much for the question and for the nice introduction. DPI, as you said, is a different way of operating than the AI. We have different life cycle. If you look at DPI, it's kind of a framework that we have put on the top of the digital transformation, in particular for public services, essentially built up in three main building blocks: ID, financial transactions, data exchange. And then DPI is not being built for the sake of DPI. DPI should bring some concrete use cases of usage of these three main building blocks. On the top of these three blocks, we can add trade, we can add health data exchange, we can accelerate deployment of vaccine campaign, access to the social benefits, and also control the population. We have to keep to keep that in mind. AI on the opposite side is much more operating in a different life cycle, starting from data, and that's the main building block. And then there is this refining of the models and ending up with either foundational models or business-oriented model, which is driven by use cases, which is not the case of DPI. So AI for AI is this competition of foundational models, large language models, and all these new building technical blocks that we have today. But in fine, the role of AI is to accelerate healthcare, is to accelerate delivery of public services, is to accelerate education access and perform better at education access, increase the resilience in crisis management. So AI is being driven by use cases. Despite the fact that we can see that most of the existing product today in AI are not use cases driven and are mostly on large language model and foundational model, but this is the competition that you underline between the two giants, which is how to access that level of sophistication in building the best foundational model. But the real implementation of the AI when it comes to the citizens and population is driven by different use cases. And that's where I think we have the matching point. The DPI is not being built for the DPI, but to find these use cases. AI is being driven by use cases, so we can see that we have a convergence of ultimate convergence of the final goals of AI in DPI is literally about use cases. These are technologies. These are tools. These are not the solutions. And then when we bring that in mind, the main point is the human being and the user needs. Human being, human rights, safeguards, inclusivity, all these elements that are essential to maintain a technology as a sustainable technology, human right preserving technology, fully inclusive for the population. That's the point. But the second point is about user needs driven. What are population looking for from AI and DPI? Are we talking in the cloud about AI and DPI like a very philosophical discussion, or is it something that is user driven? That's where we need to go back to the reality, and that we need a bottom-up approach, bringing the user needs, user requirements, and then see where is the matching. Is it on DPI? Is it on AI? How these two can come together. Final point is just to say, DPI and AI should start together. There is no AI after DPI or DPI after AI. Both should start together, given that they both articulating around the data, which is the essential elements composing DPI and AI, and both serving the final goal, which is the user needs or citizens' rights or citizen needs.
Can I just have a quick follow-up question then? So what for you are the major bottlenecks to this user-centered approach?
The competition, first of all, because the industrial and the economic targets and goals are not well aligned with user needs often. They are much more aligned with economic perspective. So that's bringing that. We are talking more about LLMs and foundational models than the real implementation of AI on the ground, how it can be used and how it can improve the public services, health, and the well-being of the citizens. So that's the biggest issue. And then the second issue is that we do not master the entire value chain that I've been talking, or the life cycle. When it comes to the AI or DPI, we are often lacking some and have some gaps into the value chain. And these bring some hesitancy in the decision-making process and also in the vision of building an entire vision, integrated, cohesive, and holistic for the integration of these two. So it's both at the policy side, where we have no entire vision. We keep talking about sovereignty without really redefining the notion of sovereignty in the AI or DPI, where we, for sure, it's no longer the same sovereignty that we know for decades, because you can't master the entire value chain. And at the implementation side, where it's more the economic than the needs that are driving the development of the AI. Mm-hmm. And then we can see it with numbers, meaning OpenAI there are some estimation that it can get bankrupted if they keep spending on LLMs without real implementation. Mm-hmm. And it seems that everyone is pushing for that without even caring for the competition, without even caring about user needs and real implementation on the ground. So they don't have a real model to be implemented on the ground. Mm-hmm. They are missing that point.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, yeah, it's great to sort of center this conversation in the user. Yeah, what are actually the user benefits here, and putting that first. So yeah, we both sort of touched a little bit on competition, but Jane, if I can come to you now to dig deeper into that. So India, for example, has pushed for this third pathway, right? That's often the language that's used. Do you think that that's feasible in the case of AI being further integrated into DPI, or do you think that a divergence from US and China technology stack is simply unrealistic?
Okay, that's fine. Good afternoon. Oh, still my one. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you, Rowan, and thank you, Dr. Mehdi, for that very good intervention, the opening. Before I go into the answer, just to say that I'm Jane Munga, and I am at the Africa program. I want to say that because most of the work and the research I do is answered from a lens from Africa, and but I think a lot of the answers here is you can easily equate them to most of the developing countries. So a third way, I don't know. I want almost to reframe that question. Because is that what we want? Is that what the global south needs? Do we want a third way, or should we start more defining what kind of applications that we are talking about that's needs? And I think when we talk about a third way, it's almost like we're trying to disentangle, almost come out of the current technology offerings that are there. And there's some aspects of that that may not be well suited for Africa or for developing countries. But it doesn't mean that we need to create another autocracy system whereby we are now building our own systems, I think it's a question of how do we bring back the value, so agency around it, and how do we ensure that we're able to build solutions that work for the continent or for the regions that we represent. One of the things I just want to double click on is what Dr. Mehdi said, that when we talk about building AI and DPI, it's about, for the developing countries, there's some similarities. And it's about applications. It's about how do you ensure that we are building solutions that help socioeconomic development, provide jobs, move applications for education, health. And you can see that with the narrative of DPI, especially that was driven by India. So how do you ensure that is what we are driving, as opposed to coming out of a third way or saying we have new technologies? But then what kind of agency can we build about that? And lastly but not least, I think I want to highlight and almost put a shameless plug of a paper, and myself and Lakshmi, who's back there, we just did at Carnegie. And we talk about how maybe what now would call a third way is how countries in the developing regions can come together through cooperation and start developing these solutions together. The first thing we identify is already work with what's existing, because when you talk about India, there's the India AI mission. When you go to other regions, there's LATAM GPT. So there's a lot of solutions already coming out of these regions. So how do we get better linkages? I hope that's something that comes out of this India AI Summit. The second thing we identify is how do we get more governments investing. A lot of some of these conversations have been driven by donors. Nothing wrong with donors, but I think it's important that national budgets are being dedicated, so there's agency in a country driving its own agenda. And the third thing that we really talk about is third spaces. If we can leave the India AI Summit with third spaces, where if you're an innovator in India and you're interested in something happening in Brazil, what are those linkages that we can form for those spaces to be processed, so that we move on having solutions that are being driven by the needs of the developing South. So that would be I guess my third way.
Great. Can I just ask a follow-up on the international cooperation piece that you've been doing? You know, Mark Carney delivered a very popular, in many circles, a very popular speech at the World Economic Forum just a few weeks back, where he described a global rupture in our geopolitical landscape. So given that we are seeing this rupture, what kind of new forums for cooperation do you see, or potentially states that you're talking to, discussing as maybe a more viable way than previous alliances?
First and foremost, I'm not endorsing, but I think we all understand the frustration. I think I would call it the frustrations of what's happening in the ecosystem right now. There is a very strong pull and tag by two very strong powers to drive that. And I think this is where the international cooperation that can come in is that countries that truly understand these our priorities can just come out and sign collaboration agreements and cooperation. We may have, I mean, it's always better to do it through bodies. So if there's an Asian body, or if there's an African body, it'll be easier to do that. But I think at the onset, even if two countries, I'm from Kenya, that's the origin country of mine, if Kenya can come to the table and sit with India and say, we are living this place, how are we going to ensure skills? India is very good with skilling talent. On the other hand, countries like Kenya want to really skill their talent. How do we get research institutions working together to skill that? When it comes to AI centers and so forth, what are some of those collaborations that we can come out of? So for me, I would say it's almost like a democratized way of international cooperation, where countries come together, and maybe at the end they can have their own, I don't want to call it Pax Silica, but their own their own way of connecting through their similar desired challenges and where they want to go with AI and DPI.
Thank you. I mean, we've sort of skirted around the edges of sovereignty, right? This word that is very difficult to define and seems kind of, in many ways, unrealistic for a lot of states. So, Kunal, if I can come to you quickly on how do you balance sovereignty, this kind of goal that people are trying to achieve, or at least some level of greater autonomy, I think is maybe more pragmatic, with the drive of interoperability, the principle of interoperability in DPI. Are the two kind of, is there an inherent tension between them?
Yeah, I would say so. Thanks for the question and thanks for the points made to the panelists before me. Essentially, yeah, it's a contradictory statement sometimes, especially when you look at it from a very definitional place. You see sovereignty as sort of creating your own power, control, agency around models, data, skill, and so on and so forth. But we're also approaching a global world order where collaboration is critical. So we can't actually do a lot of these things in isolation. But there is a existing friction tension between the words, between interoperability and sovereignty. And I think a lot of the times it gets confused as, in order for this to happen, the specialized goods, products, services need to come in, and then the retention of that stays within the power and confine of the country that has sort of imported that. But I think what we're realizing slowly is that while at a very first principle of value level, the definitions of digital sovereignty remain similar-ish, I think the deep down granular places are where the differentiating factors come about. So it is very tough to actually come to the table and say that this is exactly what we want and how do we provide this. But what we're trying to actually understand now, I mean globally as well as at the organization itself, we're trying to actually understand what those mean. Does data sovereignty answer a certain question around it? Does governance as a predecessor to model building, does that work as an implementable model within both of the structures? So there is a need to, I think, create that knowledge platform and to create almost this, I like to think of it as a third way between other countries and organizations to build that bridging factor. But at the end of the day, if we're going to continue sort of thinking about it as a lot of countries have the similar definitional part of it, I don't think we can get there, and this is I hope not too contentious point, but there has to be nuance embedded, and not just at the level of digital sovereignty, but even deeper into data or whichever route. I know that countries globally have differing needs, so that conversation is, I think, a bit more critical than this attempt that we have of finding similarities in the larger definition of digital sovereignty.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, from where I'm sitting, governments I'm talking to, some that are lower resourced, you have to be critical about this because ultimately this all costs money, and money that is hard to come by for some. So on the point of kind of funding, Surav, like Co-Develop, for those that don't know, is a philanthropic organization that seeks to build partnerships around DPI. Where are you seeing the role of banks in this, the role of funders in this, and how are different funding efforts trying to support a more kind of autonomous approach to AI and DPI?
Thanks, Rowan. Before I go into that question, I will slightly disagree with Kunal
Yeah.
on like the tension. I don't necessarily think it's completely in tension between sovereignty and interoperability, because I'm just coming from a digital ID conference where like sovereignty was a big discussion. And the thing there is like, if you dissect what sovereignty means for each country, it differs. Like at a level of, for instance, for most countries, it just means the autonomy in decision making and, let's say, avoiding vendor lock-in for that matter. And in that case, interoperability is actually the right principle to have, which actually preserves sovereignty rather than, but if you look at a regional lens, for instance, like interoperability is also like, a way to collaborate, but it might affect sovereignty. So if you look at the different layers of the stack at a compute level, yeah, there is a tension there, but maybe not at the data layer. That's maybe slightly a nuance. On the funding side, and I think we have all been part of this discussion for a long time, we are a philanthropic funding, and if you look at some narrative around like, DPI, a lot of the DPI momentum is also driven by like, donor funding in many countries. But I think more and more we are seeing that, countries themselves are starting to figure out how to fund DPI and digitalization, and now with AI. And for many countries which have the capacity, they're starting to think about how do we fund DPI across sectors and across functions as an infrastructure layer. Because one of the problems with funding is traditionally funding in government, in any kind of institution, is very siloed in terms of the line ministries, in terms of the functions that have budgets to fund something. So an agriculture ministry will want to protect its budget rather than building something that's interoperable and an infrastructure layer. But at the same time, there are institutions like the multilateral development banks, which provide a lot of loan funding to countries to build digital systems. There is a problem within that as well. Like, we were just discussing this before. Like, one is the time it takes. Like, an MDB will take 2 years to approve a particular loan. By the time AI will have jumped 2 models, digital tech will have like, evolved like many years. At the same time, MDBs also fund a very project-based digitization paradigm, which means that there's a lot of capital expenditure that is allowed for, but there is not a lot of operational expenditure which countries need to maintain the technology, build capacity in the long term to be able to actually with sovereignty manage those systems. We have seen some countries tackle these problems in their own ways, but I think on the funding landscape, a lot has to change in how countries procure technology, what is the market ecosystem that is responding to this demand, and that's when actually things will change for the better, in my opinion.
You just said there that a lot of countries are doing this. Can you provide some concrete examples of good use cases?
I would say one of the better examples of this that I have seen is in Ethiopia, for instance. Ethiopia is building like a digital ID, which is based on open source platform called MOSIP. But like one of the things about adopting DPGs in open source is also it's not as simple as saying I'll download code from GitHub and like just put it place. You need developers who understand that technology. They need to be like, well versed with like whatever script it's written in. They need to know how to customize it to their country's context. In many countries, they work with market vendors like system integrators, which is another layer of like, issue like, what if we are logged into this particular system integrator? What Ethiopia did from the very beginning was they did not rely on any private sector system integrator. What they did was their government had like some capacity of developers who took MOSIP, broke it down, started building it from scratch for themselves, and now they have a government body which is kind of a system integrator themselves and is completely well versed with like MOSIP as a digital ID platform. So today, FIDA ID, which is a digital ID, and they are layering a lot of AI use cases on top of that. It's completely managed by the Ethiopian ministry. Now, I mean, the good part is that they had capacity, they had like the knowledge. Not all countries have that, but that's where a lot of investments need to go, because otherwise we risk going down the same path of like, being logged into some particular tech. So I would say Ethiopia is a great example. But I think the importance there is you need to have the right institutions to be agile. You need to be able to pay developers, like, because otherwise OpenAI, Google will come and pay like, ton of salaries. So like, that's like different problems there.
Yeah, interesting. And I echo, that for those that aren't aware, to look into MOSIP and the work that they're doing. So let's bring it back to kind of global governance and actually kind of more policy question, Mehdi. The UN, how does it plan to ensure coherence, I suppose, between the different forms of international governance that it's rolling out, whether that's on AI or on DPI. So, for example, you have the Global Digital Compact, which covers a lot of the kind of innovation points of DPI, and yet we're seeing new mechanisms for global governance around AI safety. How do you square that circle? Do you see them in tension with one another? Do you see alignment between them?
Okay, thanks. Just quick question and quick comments on the previous discussion regarding sovereignty and funding. I've seen that happening in particular on the African continent, that if you are talking about sovereignty, funding is a principal piece of sovereignty. So running after multilateral banks and funders is no longer the main subject when it comes to deal with the sovereignty understanding. And Ethiopia is the best case. They declined a grant from the World Bank to develop their own vision of the digital ID. So that's a notion of strong sovereignty signal. We would like to be free on the decision-making process. Getting back to the governance, let me quickly detail what the UN is doing right now. We just announced the scientific panel composed from 40 scientists to deliver 2 reports a year on AI risks and opportunities. That's very close to the mechanism like IPCC and the climate change panel. That will deliver these reports to the global dialogue. That is also a new mechanism within the UN, the first session of the global dialogue, which will convene different multi-stakeholder global approach to the discussion, not only member states, but civil society, tech operators, and all people who are involved in the decision-making process of the governance. That will happen in July in Geneva for the first time, and the second round will be during the General Assembly in September 2027. And these are mechanisms that are being institutionalized by the Global Digital Compact that was decided last year by all member states as a first global framework on digital cooperation, which aligned with your first question on digital cooperation. It's meaning we have a lot of cooperation agreements that are managed at the level of the UN, but that was the first digital agreement we've been waiting till 2024 to get the first digital agreement to understand how we can exchange and cooperate together around the digital. While the digital was an essential component, economic component, social component, political component in our daily life. So that's the GDC, and then there is also some work led by member states to develop a global network on capacity development on AI, because it's better governed if you can understand what you are talking about, or if you know exactly what is the consequence of all the governance rules and constraints and policy that you are defining on your own development of the AI. Now, at the global level, it will be very hard to enforce these governance mechanisms and then to make accountable systems and frameworks to be implemented within that governance mechanism. There is a shift in the thinking, which is rather than going on the global governance, huge frameworks, is about thinking of what is the minimum standards, what is the minimum governance set that we should agree upon, what is the irreducible set of policy rules and governance mechanisms that should be put in place. And then you can build upon that. That will be much easier to define, but also to bring all people, all member states around that, rather than building these very complex global governance mechanisms that will be in danger for your own sovereignty decision-making process if it goes against your vision of sovereignty and vision of AI development. So getting back to the essential, what are the minimum set, and then with that, building around it a common understanding. I think the common understanding of the needs of every country and different country, and the contextualization of the governance mechanism that should be implemented around that is an essential element to enable the AI at the global majority and in particular at the global south. We are not at all at the same level when it comes to the AI developments. There was no government mechanism 10 years ago around AI when we started building AI. And then there is no reason to put very restrictive rules today for countries who would like to start their AI journey too, because that may be a disabler for their AI journey. So this is how we see it, or how I see it probably. And the area is really to reduce the complexity and to reduce the granularity to the minimum level in order to get quickly to a common agreement among the different member states, and that a strong and that can be stewarded across the AI journey and the development of the AI. It's a very experimental technology. We don't know what is coming after the AI, probably robotics and neuromorphic and neuroscience, and all these things will converge together to a new thing. So with these standards, mostly anchored into human rights, I think that we will find a way to sort out the problem of multi-layered governance that is not often interoperable.
Thank you. And yeah, important to go back to what the minimal standards are, because I think what is shocking and I mean a major challenge is that I don't think states have really adequately defined what risk is actually acceptable for them yet. And starting at that base level is kind of crucial to then build on broader governance mechanisms that people can actually adhere to. And you talked briefly, I mean, we talked about risk and sort of the geopolitical environment there. Jane, I'm going to come to you on this. Say we see a geopolitical crisis, right? We're seeing this rupture, things are fragmenting, there's increasing tensions. If a kind of crisis leads to restrictions, leads to sanctions in this increasingly globalized technology stack, what kind of contingency plans can states have in place to ensure that their technology can still meet citizens' needs? Are people thinking about that layer of risk? I mean, for example, in the context you're looking at most, in African states, do they have contingency frameworks for potential disruptions in global order?
It's a very interesting question. And I will go back into the realities of some of the African countries, especially the ones that we study, is that even before we start looking at disruption, the reality is, how do you connect Africans? How do you connect? When you look at the continent right now, about 40% are using the internet. So now you're adding another layer of fragmentation. For policymakers, I have to say the priorities that we see in the documents that are coming now, that's a big part of the research that we do, has maybe not yet matured to where we are thinking about fragmentation, but it's about building agency and ensuring that as they build their internet, that they are building systems that can have also that can also break economic precarity, so there is long-term sustainability around that. Now, maybe that's where we can start answering your question. If there's a fragmentation, then how do we start building? Because at the end of the day, for a country to be able to come out of its socioeconomic issues, it has to start building long-term economic security around its digital technologies. So there has been conversations of then how do we ensure that even the technology that is being used, especially the data systems, first, does it speak? Are we collecting data that is very inherent for the populations that you serve? And so we are beginning to see groups like Masakane, the African Voice. These are coalitions that are beginning to build large data sets to serve at least the African people. Another thing is, even within this fragmentation, if it happens, at the end of the day, there is already technology that has been deployed within these countries. So a lot of countries, the Global South, have not developed their own. So there will be some kind of technology in place. The question is how will they be able to bargain within the system? So if one side switches off, you better at least be on the other side. Anyway, I don't want to push that narrative, because I think there are bigger problems in some of these areas of the world that are thinking about fragmentation. Let's first just can we even get the basics, connectivity? Can we get energy there? And I think that's why for this conversation coming to India is we also have to handle this conversation in layers. Yes, there are these existential risks, but we still have the very reality risks of the continent, the Global South. And can we start looking at that from a very fragmented level, as much as we want to drive this, but also what does it matter? Because at the end of the day, we want employment. We want to make sure Africa has the highest youth bulge. A lot of people don't have jobs. How can we make sure that AI and DPI is providing economic solution jobs? Innovators are being built, and they are building to scale. So for me, that's I guess, trying to bring back that conversation to that angle, even as we talk about the bigger issues of sovereignty and so forth. And back to the question that was discussed here, I really didn't want to jump into it because I have very strong views on that. And I think there's also an opportunity for the UN maybe to unpack that with this scientific council. Is exactly how do you define sovereignty when it comes to digital layers? Because when we think about sovereignty as a country's sovereign right to determine itself, it may not be possible in digital, but it's still a very important question when we go into these technologies. But anyway, that was not the question. But I just it's not something we can wish away that easily, and especially when you have the power and you're the one holding the key, you can say, oh no, so forth. But it is a real issue for the countries that are building their own technology.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, there's some, real pressing challenges for people today that need to be dealt with first. I hear that point. So, Kunal, India is somewhat pitching itself as, I've heard the term like Southwestern partner on like AI-DPI partnerships. As an alternative, I suppose, to the US and China, what do you think India's USP is in perhaps dealing with some of the problems that Jane's just addressed?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is how have we been through the life cycle of it? I know that we had some similar questions a few years ago, and a lot of the ground research that we do, I think, comes out similarly in the lived experiences of it. So, for example, I think we were worried about let's get employment sorted first, and then we can worry about the data consent and data safety and principles and rights and so on. So I think there's a lived experience part of it where there's a huge amount of experience and expertise, I dare say, that can be shared. I think a big part of it is obviously, of course, the sort of varied multimodal approaches that we have. So we have a lot of proprietary, we have a lot of open source. So I think that becomes a big play. I sometimes sort of shudder to think how many different options we should create as a sort of way to kind of create adoption globally. But there are a lot of available approaches and pathways that exist. I think the next part of it is the integration component, is that how have we thought about DPI? There has been a lot of interoperability. We've seen the rise of public-private partnerships like never before. Something that, whether you want to call it a paradigm shift, how partnership models are discussed, or if it's just a signal of the times, it's happened. So how do we contest with that? How do we make sure that that is done in a way that represents not just the global economic or the nation economic agenda, but how do you make sure that it has a component of the user and the human at the end of it? So that's a big part of it. This might be fairly controversial, but I think the point that we're trying to make is that it's a good thought process. It's a great way to start thinking about it. The values and principles might differ, but there might be some things that we can also help highlight as risk. So the risk identification part of it could also be something that we could highlight from here. And then, of course, there's the skill. There's the I hope I'm not sort of don't have to elaborate on the larger marketplace solutions that India might have. But some of the softer angles is something that we're trying to also figure out as a form of export, so to speak.
Thank you. Saurav, can I come to you with the same question? I'm sorry, I'm leaning into the fact that you both are our Indian nationals on the panel. How would you kind of describe India's USP in all of this?
In the DPI space, our USP is Bangalore visits, which no other country has. But on a serious note, I think there's been a lot of different sorts of innovation. I think the how parts of what India has done is not actually well documented, well packaged, and well evangelized yet, in my opinion, because I think when people, like, we hear a lot of countries say that, oh, we want to do something like Aadhaar, for instance, But Aadhaar didn't just happen like, in 1 year, 2 years. It took 15 years of lot of back and forth, lot of challenges, lot of like, technical choices. And I think a lot of that is kind of in the heads of a lot of people or in government documentation, in my understanding. It's not out there. So there's a lot that can be learned. Like obviously people know about the technological aspects of how we did things, how we built UPI, what is the principles of UPI. But I think that's one of the things I think would be important. Like for instance, even to me, it's a lot of surprise sometimes that, one of the things that countries have a problem with in terms of when building digital ID is like lock-in at the level of the biometric uh, ABIS system essentially. But what India did was they had 3 vendors at the same time providing the ABIS services, so that no one vendor will ever have monopoly over providing services for Aadhaar or any kind of stuff. So those are the kind of things that are not out there, and I feel like India can do a better job of like having that out there. And not just India, I feel like it can come from like Brazil and Estonia or any other country that's doing it. On the AI side of things, I also think there's a lot of new thinking, new ways of doing things that are coming up that need to be more out there. For instance, I think like Dr. Mehndi Jain had mentioned, like ultimately the idea is like what is the problem we are solving for, and what is the value we are creating for the citizen. And I think a lot of the principles that we have built technology over the last 2 decades is also being applied to AI. Like for instance, public benefit is at the center of how a lot of AI application is happening. And how do you make sure that public benefit is like a central concept of how you support technology? Do you have like an open source first principles in government? Those are the kind of things that India can kind of make a take it out and have other countries adopt it. I think it's a lot about like the how part of things rather than the what, because each country wants to do the what their way. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, big thumbs up on public benefit and open source solutions. I'm now going to turn to the audience. We've got about 10, 15 minutes for questions, and I'll turn to you first, Dr. Mehdi, because I know you have to leave a bit early. If you have to leave now as well, then please feel free. But we'll just take 3 first and see how we go. Yes, over here. I don't know. Do we have mics? I'll do it.
Namaste.
Thank you.
Namaste. Good afternoon to respected authorities from United Nations Organization and respected members in the panel and respected members in the audience. My question is relating to what is the need and capability of the sustainable and eco-friendly, safely, healthy, securely, and emotionally, sentimentally, knowingly, unknowingly, intentionally, in A to Z perspective, the need and capability of sustainable, trustworthy relationship between United Nations Organization and member countries and United Nations organizations, in vice versa, relating to artificial intelligence development, implementation, and making a eco-friendly, healthy, safely, securely, sustainable environment.
We're going to need a little bit of a tighter question than that. Otherwise, I think there'll be too much for the panel to dive into. If we could go to you, sir, as well, and then the woman, yes, you at the back, yeah.
So my question is with respect to how international collaboration is playing out with AI and DPI nexus. So can countries collaborate in creation of joint regulatory sandboxes across sector, wherein you're not just solving the problems of your country, but it's a co-creation, co-identification of a problem. So 4 or 5 countries can come together and the best case can be scaled up. And I think that is in continuation to how use cases have been released as part of this summit. So how do you see regulatory sandboxes being the pathway of enabling AI-DPI access?
Thank you. Great question. Yes, and you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everyone. My question is that we were talking about sovereignty and how difficult it is to actually define it. We are seeing India as being a bearer of how in Global South it will lead further in AI development and sharing it with different countries. My question is, there is an inherent difference when it comes to development and defining of AI sovereignty between Global South and Global North. So how do we see a convergence between both the blocks, and out an international institution or a framework where we can collaborate on the definitions, or working out in different layers and stack of AI. So how do we see that and work on it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Dr. Mehdi, feel free to take any of those.
Hello. Yeah. Sorry, I probably will mix all the answers in one. This is not meaning. Let's be very realistic. There is a big competition because there is a big economic value, but also the power of these technologies. We're positioning of the power, the power that could bring these technologies to the member states. So, and that's life. That's real life, and that's the real geopolitics context. It's a competition. So making countries collaborating together beyond the UN vision, meaning, is very hard. In particular, those who are leading on the competition. And then without those countries that are leading on the competition, we are missing piece of the stack of the development of the AI or the DPI. Meaning, it can go from rare earth to GPUs to chips to energy to data to models. So it can be a various part of the stack that are missing, and then that's not the goal of building the cooperation. Then now with the GDC and the cooperation vision, there are no rules. There are pathways of cooperation, and then we cannot define rules. And then pathways are often impacted by the reality of on the ground of the geopolitics, tension, crisis, and the competition again. And so it's not up to the UN, I think, to define. It's mostly the UN that is bringing the convening, the forum, the place to discuss. But it's back again within the hands of the member states and the country to decide if they want to cooperate or not and how they would like to cooperate. And we have no words to say on that. This is a sovereign decision-making process coming from member states, impacting their own vision of the technology and their sovereignty and how they would like to compete. Either India, China, the US, South Africa, or France, all these countries got to decide on how they would like to cooperate with each other. And then we can see that there are some global north around the Mediterranean cooperation, literally about the energy exchange, data exchange, south to south cooperation when it comes to the DPA and AI, trying to get some clusters based on user requirement in their vision of DPI and trying to build some common solutions to that. But this is something that is purely driven by the politics and by the policymakers of member states, and not at all by the at the UN level, where it's more a forum of discussion where we can bring these pathways, but never anything else than a recommendation.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to answer the
Please.
regulatory sandbox related question off of, I think, what Dr. Mehdi said, right? Innovative governance. Sorry? Okay. Yeah, I think this works. Just to double in, I think, and use his response as a framework. Regulatory sandboxes are particularly hard. We're trying to build one out in Karnataka in some capacity. The interdepartmental liaisoning is insane. Innovative governance models that approach and use this to create collaborative standard setting and all of that, that is the right way. How is something that's being kind of figured out at the moment. I do see a vision, or I do see a goal in which simultaneous testing, regulatory as well as sort of technological and governance, all of it can be thought about collectively. But the amount of liaisoning that is required between, or to do all of that, like he mentioned, it is very specific, it is very agenda-led, it is very, and I'm not saying this in a negative way. The way in which risks are identified between different departments, countries, etc., are critical. You cannot let go of certain jurisdictional things because you want to align to a larger goal, and the agendas need to vary. So it is a mass effect effort, but I don't think it we're not sure if that's the way to approach it at the moment.
All right, should we take another round of 3 questions? Yes, the gentleman in the blue suit, the woman there with the glasses, and then maybe one from over this side of the room as well, you sir.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure in what. I'm not technical enough to answer your question in terms of how you mean AI under the DPG definition, but I work very closely with a lot of DPGs in the DPI space. It solves for some issues. It doesn't solve for everything. For instance, one of the issues that we see particularly right now is, yes, DPGs are open source. They meet a certain level of standards. But it's a very technical, thing. It's easy to solve. The technology has been solved for in the DPI space. But the problem governments are now facing is even open source is to something that to manage, to govern, it's not easy. Governments don't have the framework to work with something like a DPG. How do you procure it? How do you govern it? It's not that easy to just say that AI becoming like a DPG becoming like an AI standard will solve that. And the second question is sustainability. DPGs are maintained by a lot of philanthropic donor funding. That is shrinking in increasingly in this world. There are very few funders who fund DPGs for the tech itself. So I don't think that will solve it. Yes, it is a good idea in terms of having some technical standards on AI, but maybe not the full solution in my opinion.